this is Telltale. I'm Greg.
I'm Emily.
Emily. And we're going to talk about an old play this time. From way back, I forget exactly, early 1600s, I think. Around the time of Shakespeare. A British playwright named Thomas Middleton. And the play is called The Witch. The Witch is a play written by Thomas Middleton, published, it's thought to have been written between 1613 and 1616. And it existed only in manuscript until published by Isaac Reed in 1778. But it was performed back then, and it had a big influence, along with Shakespeare's Macbeth, on people's thoughts about witches. This was happening at a time when a book was published that was denouncing witches and making all kinds of claims about witchcraft and such. But before this time, witches had, and I didn't realize this, witches had actually been employed by the church.
Yep. It was actually very common for wise women, who do you think the wise men were in the Bible, were employed in churches for healing things and like end-of-life rites. It was very common to have that kind of thing happen. And have women be... Actually, it was very interesting because it's like one of the few social roles that a woman could actually have in a church, considering it was primarily patriarchal. So,
yeah,
interesting turn of events there.
So this play was performed during the early 1600s at a time when there were a lot of witch trials going on. And the King of England at that time was backing a lot of this activity and promoting people to go out and seek out witches and try them and kill them. And of course we know how that went. A lot of innocent people were killed, along with women that were practicing witchcraft, who really were just the doctors of their day, using herbal medicines, but it was considered witchcraft, and they didn't hide that fact. They called themselves witches, but they were really just performing the early medicine. But because it wasn't sanctified by the king and the church, they were tried, found guilty, and tortured or executed, or both. Very
heinous ways. There was almost always an execution. Very few people actually got off just with torture. And it was primarily, there were some men, but it was primarily women. And if you ever read the book that in question that caused the witch hysteria, the witch's hammer, I can't remember the Latin term for it at this time.
Okay.
But it was very blatantly against women. Very blatantly hateful towards women. I think there's an entire section where he just talks about how women are just a necessary evil for childbirth. Men would be better without, blatantly saying men would be better without women, but alas, here we are. And it's just like, really, dude? Come on. A bishop wrote this, by the way.
Yeah.
It was actually a bishop who wrote that book. So, super starting the hatred of women in the church, and very, very isolating patriarchal culture that was already starting to be hinted at, but just kind of, people just embraced it.
Yeah.
They just embraced this mentality, so.
In a lot of cases, I think it was more power plays, being able to take property and take positions and stuff. If you could claim that somebody was a witch and get them hung,
get
now
money.
You have the ability to just take over what they have without, and you had the law on your side because they were witches.
Yeah, bounty hunting and stuff like that too became a big thing. Witch hunting, it was lucrative. It was very lucrative. So people just, that was capitalism for you. You were a poor serf and became a witch hunter and got money for it. Good job.
But of course, the bishop she mentions that wrote that book, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, and Rome did not agree with that. They denounced it.
Yeah. 3 years after it was published, they officially, publicly denounced it. But the damage had already been done. It was so integrated into culture by that point.
Mm-hmm.
It was terrible.
But the Catholic Church officials in the Catholic Church were hiring witches to perform services for them. Not exactly clear what they were doing for the church, but they were being hired by the Catholic Church. And this led Thomas Middleton, who is noted as a satirist. He wanted to blast this practice of the Catholic Church, and so he wrote the play The Witches to denounce not just the witches, but the people who were hiring them.
It was basically calling out the hypocrisy of the church. Like, you can't demand a service and then degrade and murder the people providing that service, kind of thing. So, which makes sense. You can't do that. That's not a good support system for your businesses.
Yeah, but you also have to remember at that time the Church of England had only fairly recently broken off from the Vatican, and for reasons that were not good. A king that just wanted to have different wives. And so the Church of England was not seeing eye to eye with the Vatican, and they latched on to whatever reason they could to denounce the Vatican.
Yep.
So this was all the whole situation was totally political and had a lot to do with certain people grabbing certain power over the people, over society, in the church. So Middleton wrote a very over-the-top play.
Yeah. It was very over-the-top.
Yeah. It floored me in Act 1, Scene 2, when the primary witch was introduced, and the things she was described as...
Or something,
Hecate, whatever.
Hecate, yeah.
Pretty much every possible evil that could be ascribed to somebody was put into her personality and characterization. And in one way, if you read it, it's kind of funny. In another way, if you read it, it's like a horror story. But when you then dig into the politics of the age, Middleton was feeding into a frenzy that was only self-serving to certain politicians looking to grab power. And he was just siding with them and doing what it took to cement their position in power. So...
that's really reinforced in the synopsis of this story. So there's a lot that goes on. Somebody disguises themselves as a servant and is going undercover to like dig up dirt on people and figure out like all the corruption that's going on in these various households. Somebody's pregnant, a woman's pregnant out of wedlock, and she's trying to find someone who will be her husband, or like trying to quietly wander away to have birth, to give birth if she can't find a husband. Some guy's just a lech, and he's after tail left and right, and then there's a duchess who's tried to kill her husband, so that she could, be more powerful than he was. And I think and there's newlyweds who are trying to be separated by someone who's trying to make it seem like someone's cheating on the other.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a lot of corruption that goes on. It's very high drama. It's written in a Shakespearean tone, so I had to read a couple of times to make sure I was comprehending the story. And I also really struggled to keep track of the names of people.
Yeah.
They're very unusual names. The Duke and the Duchess were the easiest ones, because they were just called the Duke and the Duchess.
Yeah, that's easy.
But, yeah, so the whole storyline is basically all this drama happening at once, while this... I guess, like, the primary character is, like, the undercover guy who's the servant. Like, he's pretending to be a servant. Yeah. He's kind of the primary who's, like, witnessing a lot of this. There's a lot of asides that go on where people are just kind of expressing their personal views. And it's just, like, it speaks a lot to the age that they were in, where everything was about how things looked and who dies with the most, basically. So... the drama was really good. It kind of, like, just progressed into, like, this crazy climax where everybody's pretty much going to these witches to come up with poisons or love potions or something to try and assist their situation. None of which worked. The witches were like super grody. Like very like this book and Macbeth kind of set the tone, I guess, for the stereotypes of witches based off of the witch's hammer and basically the thoughts of King James himself about witchcraft and things like that. So I mean, a lot of this just played into the stereotype to a very damaging effect and view of women in society.
Yes.
So like these witches were like super grody, old, gross, incestuous, sleeping with each other, flew on broomsticks, eat gross soups with Eye of Newt and babies.
Yeah, they
in
were.
it. They were eating babies.
I think her son was capturing babies so that she could cook them and eat them.
Yeah, they eat the babies. I mean, so it's extremely harsh, but very common stereotypes for witchcraft and witches in that day. They just kind of made these people out to be like the most satanic sounding, horrible beings that ever existed. And so, like, it's just kind of funny because this whole story is these people, like, being absolutely appalled that the witches exist, but also going to them demanding the service. Mm-hmm. So it's just kind of interesting because you've got this juxtaposition of, I need you. And none of the witches' things actually work. And eventually all the witches just go and fly off on their broomsticks before shit hits the fan kind of thing.
Yeah.
So the whole thing is just a lot of irony. I really liked the drama of the story. The end was super disappointing.
Yeah.
I was very disappointed with the end. I don't want to spoil it for everybody.
Although that one, I mean, it's 500 years old.
Yeah. I mean, it's basically everybody just finds out everybody was screwing each other. And they're all just, like, okay with it. Like, they all just kind of forgive each other. Mm-hmm. Especially the Duke, who's not actually dead. He was playing dead. And then he's like, oh, it's okay, Duchess. Let's just start over. I kind of wanted him to just pop up and stab her. Like, that would have been at least a satisfying closure of an ending. But it's like, no, we're just going to do what God wants and forgive. And I'm just like, that is not realistic at all. All these people just try to destroy each other's lives. This is, like, the worst rom-com I've ever seen. And rom-coms are pretty terrible. Usually there's some kind of deception or some kind of, like, awful human beings being awful to each other and falling in love. That's kind of what this felt like. But to a very high extreme. I only gave it 3 stars on Goodreads.
Yeah, me too.
It wasn't...
It's
okay. Like, the drama
it's important
was good.
English literature. Especially since... You know, we all know about Shakespeare, and we don't hear about all the other playwrights at that time that were writing plays that were, in many cases, as good as Shakespeare, or at least nearly as good as Shakespeare, and you don't hear anything of them anymore.
Yeah. Or morality plays. Like, there are a lot of morality plays that were super popular, and they just have gone missing, or they're dead. Like, we're lucky to have the manuscript for every man.
Yeah.
But, like, yeah, this was a common form of entertainment and art form.
Yeah, you didn't have novels or short stories back then. They didn't exist yet. Yeah. You had plays and you had poetry, and that was largely that and music.
Yeah. And if you were poor, you were lucky to have street performers.
Yeah.
Seriously. Like, that was their entertainment. That was it. That's all there was.
No Netflix.
Yeah. Nobody was literate, really, either. There were very few literate people. So it was one of those things where even if you had books, if you were lucky enough to have books, you may not have been lucky enough to know how to read them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, this was an important entertainment at the time, and an important way of communicating. That you know, as we have seen the ideas put forth in this play, people kind of bought it and believed it. So it had a huge influence, which Shakespeare also did. And Marlowe's Faust was written during this time. Marlowe is another one that is very important for this time period, that most people would go, Marlowe who? Huh?
Yeah.
Wasn't he in Charles Dickens? Or
Yeah.
No, Christopher Marlowe was a playwright in Elizabethan England at the same time as Shakespeare, and wrote some very great plays. But a lot of people have forgotten this. They've fallen by the wayside. Reading it, I didn't think the English was as bad as Shakespeare. I thought it was easier to read than Shakespeare.
Yeah, it was actually pretty easy for the most part. I got a lot of comprehension. I have. It is a similar style, though. If you struggle with Shakespeare, you might have to reread this again just to make sure you're comprehending it, or do like a, side by side. If you can find like somebody who wrote plain English and original language, you can find some of those kinds of things out there, especially with Shakespeare. But yeah, I did actually find it a lot easier to read because there's not a lot of extra made-up words that Shakespeare added and just kind of threw in there. It was very plain language for the most part. For the Shakespearean style, it was kind of in.
Yeah, so it's a little more accessible than Shakespeare is for its time. But you got to remember, it is nearly 500 years old, and it comes from a very different time, a very different political environment, very different religious environment than what we have today. And if the person who would want to read this really is the person who wants to know more about that period of history. Or also, like I say, if you approach it as like kind of a satirical horror story and don't take the politics seriously in it, then you can read it on that end.
Yeah, you could almost read it like a comedy too. Because some of the situation is just such absurd situational, almost humor.
Yeah.
Like, it could easily be interpreted as a comedy at this point.
And that's why going into this, I thought it was just going to be satirical against all the stupid attitudes about witchcraft back then. But then it turned out to be in support of them. I thought, oh no.
But you kind of were, like, excommunicated from all of society, not just the church, if you didn't agree with the church. Because at the time, they had this really big thing where, like, if you denounce the church's infallibility, you were against the church and God and definitely practicing witchcraft and probably, in line with Satan.
Yeah, because around this time they were chasing both Kepler and Galileo all over Europe, trying to bring them to justice for teaching that the world isn't flat and that the Earth isn't the center of the solar system.
Yeah.
So, they were heretics and being taught. And that's the kind of climate you had the Spanish Inquisition going on about this time where a lot of people were being killed. It was a very dark period for mankind, Europe, and religion in particular.
Yeah, it was not a very understanding time.
No, it was a time where we were transitioning from a society where the church ruled over all to a society where the church did not rule over all, and our daily lives were not controlled by them. And it was a tough transition. They did not want to let go. They were right, damn it, and they weren't going to listen to any other views. Yep.
They had the ultimate truth, so they were like, oh, well, we should be the ultimate authority. And seeing, like, this transition from a very strict religious society into more secularism is it was a very dark time, because morality was put in question, which is funny, because morality is a philosophy, it's not a religion.
Yeah, well, I mean,
like,
everything springs ultimately from the foundation of philosophy. Religion, art, science, all that stuff has its beginnings in people just thinking about what is the best way to live and act. And so, religion has taken up that side of it.
Yes.
Mainly because getting people to act in an ethical, moral manner, you have to threaten them with hellfire
with
and damnation.
Some kind of consequence, yeah.
In the past, you've had to threaten them that something's going to fall out of the sky and kill them if they didn't act right.
Or complete annihilation altogether.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you had to give them threats in order to, like... And things were pretty, like... It was pretty anarchist. If you lived in rural England, like, you were kind of... Especially if you were a farmer out in the middle of nowhere, like, you were pretty much on your own. Like, anybody could just come in and murder you and no one would know. Yeah. Or, like, you could go and murder somebody else and no one would know. Like, if you had nobles who kept tabs on you, I mean, maybe not. But for the most part, nobility was kind of starting to... This was the period of time when nobility was kind of starting to fall more out of favor. Yeah. So it wasn't as big of an issue. Everything was very, very anarchist. Like, you were... It was nuts. It was the Wild West of England. at this time, pretty much.
This time period is why people fled to the New World. They
Mm-hmm.
wanted to get away from all the persecution they were going through in England and other areas of Europe, by basically a church-led aristocracy that felt they had the right to do whatever they wanted.
Yep. And were infallible. You couldn't even question it because it was ordained by God.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it was very hard to do anything outside of the realm of the church, for sure.
Yeah, which of course was a total distortion of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But,
that's a whole other...
That's not a...
Yeah, that's a whole other video we could do, honestly. Like,
exactly.
It's crazy. But yes, it's, the work is important, I think, for just understanding the time period, understanding the views people had of witchcraft, the views people had of power and the seductiveness of power in various forms, corruption in general. It was just I was really sad about the ending. It was so disappointing. Because it had such great drama and such a great climax and, like, everything, like, oh yeah, shit's gonna hit the fan, and then everyone's like, oh, well, I guess we'll just forgive each other and try to move forward from this.
Mm-hmm.
Or y'all could murder each other. At least they did that in Hamlet.
Yeah.
Just kill each other off. Fine.
So I think for modern audiences, this is problematical, but the only people who would really want to read it are people who want to learn about the literature, learn about the history of the time period, and just as an entertainment to sit down and enjoy. I'm not so sure that modern audiences are going to be that interested in this.
Mm-hmm. It is. It does take a little bit more effort, I think, to read too if you're not used to Shakespearean language, Shakespearean style language. I think younger audiences would have a really hard time with this.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah,
older audiences are going to be like, I mean, it's kind of hit or miss. Like, if you like, I think if people enjoy Shakespeare, though, they would probably enjoy this play.
Yeah, well, Shakespeare's, we're going to cover that
we'll cover that in another video.
Soon, but Shakespeare is a whole nother thing where pretty much, like you've said before, every story we use today is basically retelling the Bible, and I say, well, and Shakespeare.
And Shakespeare, pretty much, yeah.
He laid the foundation of all the stories we do today in many ways. We just do variations on what he did. So, it's just the years have caused his language to fall by the wayside. So it makes it very difficult for us to read, but the stories are the same as what we're still doing.
Yeah, they're all very similar. Just look at Disney.
Yeah.
Kid you not. Look at Disney. Compare Shakespeare to Disney movies. You'll have fun with that one.
Yep.
But yeah. So
that's all I got to say. This is historically significant, historically extremely significant, but as far as calling it a top tale and saying that you should run out and read it, no, it's not going to get on that list.
No, it is a very niche piece of literature, and I don't really have much else to say about it either, other than I am still very disappointed with the end. It had such great potential to be so much more dramatic and really cool.
Yeah, but on that, I think Middleton was trying to make the point that when people turned away from all their evil ways, then life was wonderful. Because he was trying to speak out against the practice of hiring witches.
Yeah, he was trying to kind of do a morality play sort of thing. That's understandable.
Yeah.
But yeah. Anyway, not a top tale, but...
No. But an interesting historical document.
Yes. Not something you're going to want to read on the beach.
No.
Ever. Do not read on the beach.
No, or if you're in a hippie commune.
Or if you're eating spaghetti.
Huh?
With the baby part.
Oh. Yeah.
Don't eat spaghetti while you're reading this book, if you so choose to read. Honestly, I don't want to say it was a waste of time, but I felt like it was a waste of time to read it.
Yeah.
It was worth remarking on. So, I mean, yeah. If you like plays and like Shakespeare, you might like this. If not,
Yeah,
don't worry about it.
I thought I was going to find this cool early horror play that we would enjoy. No.
Yeah. I mean, it was enjoyable up until the end. Then I was like, well, everything that just happened means nothing to me now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not invested anymore. Couldn't be invested anymore. So it's like, oh well.
Yeah, well, like you say, Act
Whatever.
1, Scene 2 is where it lost me because it was just so over the top.
I
It's
know.
like, this is just
Incestuous
ridiculous.
baby eating.
And that's when I had to go on
Got it.
Wikipedia looking up more about this to find out the historical situation.
Potentially lesbian too, because there were 2 other women.
Yes,
And yeah,
they were
like
doing
incestuous, lesbian.
And sleeping with everyone.
Yeah, whores. Yeah,
Mhm.
who ate
Every
babies.
possible evil you could come up with was ascribed to these witches.
They were basically the 120 Days of Sodom.
Yeah.
Or something. 120 Days of... Yeah. By the Marquis.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway. So yeah, that's all we gotta say.
Yeah. So on to our next video.
Yep. Like,
Hope-
subscribe. Let us know what you think. If you end up reading it,
Mm-hmm.
please don't waste your time though. There's so many. There are so many better books out there.
Exactly.
Than
Like
this.
The Shadow Witch, if you want to read about a witch.
That was a good one.
Good one. A
Really
nice
enjoyed that one.
It wasn't so offensive.
Yeah. So, until next time.
Okay.
Bye.